Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Southern Fried Podcast, a production of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. I'm Rex Nelson, senior editor for the Democrat Gazette, and boy, education has really been in the news in Arkansas in recent weeks, so we're going to talk education today on the Southern Fried Podcast, all the way down from Bentonville. Ben Kutylo of Forward, Arkansas. Ben, thank you for making the trip, and thank you for visiting with us today.
Well, of course. Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
All right. I'm not going to take for granted, and I never do, so we start kind of basic, that our listeners even know what Forward is. So give us the Cliff Notes version of what the organization is, what it does.
Sure. We were started in 2015. It was created by the Walton Family Foundation, the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, and really to be an external strategic partner to the state around education. So we connect and convene stakeholders, philanthropists, business leaders, state leaders, as well as community members, to really identify opportunities and drive kind of collective action against those opportunities. We also work directly in communities. So we provide direct support to schools, districts, and communities to really identify their needs and chart a path forward to kind of reach those needs and address those priorities for students.
We were talking before the program. You grew up in the Cincinnati area, moved here from Boston, a job opportunity for your wife, but you had been involved in education. Tell us a little bit about your background so we can get to know you a little bit better.
Sure, of course. So I spent the first 8 or 9 years of my career in technology, actually private sector technology. And at that point in time, decided I wanted to do work that was more meaningful for me and made an intentional transition into education. So that was about, 14 years ago now. So since then, I've been working in consulting, philanthropy for nonprofits, a little bit of time in education technology, and really doing work similar to what I do now at Forward, but in other parts of the country. So a little bit in Boston, quite a bit in Chicago, but also other parts of the country as well, Michigan, Colorado.
How does doing work in places, and we'll get a little more in depth on your recent report and so forth, but just in general, I'm wondering, how does doing work in places like a Chicago, like a Boston, differ from doing work statewide in what is still a largely rural state like Arkansas?
Yeah. That's a great question. And certainly it was a bit of a learning curve for me.
I would think so.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'll say right off the top that I took this job and got excited about this job and doing it in Arkansas because actually compared to places like Chicago, I believe the opportunity for dramatic change, improvement, transformation exists here, and the ingredients exist here, even as compared to places like Chicago. So in Chicago, first you have, as an example, you have it's huge in scale. So just in that school district alone, you have 650 schools. We have just over 1,000 in the entire state of Arkansas. So the scale is enormous. You have just an incredible level of complexity there, and just historical kind of challenge. Whereas here in Arkansas, again, and these are kind of some of the reasons why I took the job. Here we have, we've got committed state leaders. We have an incredibly engaged and invested corporate philanthropic sector. We do have largely, a huge part of the state are small rural communities. But in these communities, these folks are proud, invested in their communities. The dynamics, in many ways are good. And they're open and eager to do better for their kids and do better in education. So for all these reasons, and these are, some of these things differ from places like Chicago. Again, that's the difference in doing the work here, but what I also believe is kind of the opportunity.
Yeah, and you have basically answered what was my next question, and that was, and if you want to dive a little deeper on this, when you looked at Forward, Arkansas, why did you say this is a good fit for me?
Yeah, well, this is the type of work that I've been doing for a long time. And so it is really, it's strategic work. It involves, we have all these ingredients, like I just said, in the state. We've got, a lot of folks that are heavily invested. We have communities that are invested, but they're really, at times in the state, there isn't necessarily an organization pulling all those pieces together. right? Bringing all those stakeholders, all those pieces together and identifying kind of shared goals and opportunities to move forward collectively. And I think that is really the key to making real progress, or that is one key to making real progress in education here in the state. And that is the role that Forward tries to play.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to get to the 2023 report that was released, but let's set the background. Tell me about the previous study and how that really built an agenda for Forward Arkansas.
Yeah. So
the work before you got here.
Yeah, for sure. So in 2015, really when the organization was started, and so they led a similar process. And so it consisted of, analyzing education data, but really the biggest part of it was a statewide engagement effort of folks throughout the state, community members, state leaders, really everyone top to bottom, left to right, to identify kind of, again, those shared needs and priorities, figure out where we are currently, and set some goals and kind of priorities as we move forward. And that really kind of was around or part of the founding of Forward, and that really kind of launched our work, or launched the organization's work at that time.
So why did we decide to embark on this whole process all over again?
Yeah.
Why did there need to be a new report?
Yeah. Few reasons. So first, it's been 8 years since that. It's been 8 years since that report, and
which is an eternity.
Which is a long time.
Yeah,
which is a long time, especially in education.
Yep.
I think, unfortunately, we knew generally that we, as a state, weren't making the progress for kids that we want and need to make. Also, in that amount of time, the landscape has changed. Lots of conditions have changed in education. And then obviously we experienced a global pandemic, which we're just emerging from the height of still. And that really disrupted every facet of education. And it also shed light on the needs and new needs that we weren't as focused on. And it also made things worse. I want to be clear, we weren't in a good spot before COVID,
right?
From an education standpoint. But COVID, brought that to light, and again, it made some things worse. So, coming from that, and on the eve of new leadership in the state, we felt it was a really important time to go through this process again to understand, again, where we are, get the voice of community members, of folks throughout the state, to understand what those needs, what those opportunities are now, what they want for their kids. And then, chart a path forward.
Let's talk process for just a second before we talk policy. How did you go about collecting all these responses? Were these actual meetings, this online survey? How did you get the information?
Yeah, it was a huge effort. We have a pretty small team at Forward, and it was a huge effort. That was over, 7-8 months, to be honest. And all of those things you just mentioned, all of them.
All of the above.
And so every way we possibly could, we wanted as much feedback as possible from as many people as possible. But I think the most important, so we had online surveys, and we got, close to 4,000. Overall, we got input from close to 4,000 Arkansans. We had surveys, we had focus groups, in person, virtual, with educators, with state leaders, lots of individual conversations with folks. But I think the most important part, we knew we needed to get feedback from community members, parents, families, others, and we knew we needed to go to those communities to do that. So we held, close to 45 in-person meetings, our team and our partners, really in every part of the state. We were trying to reach every part of the state. And so that's how we did it.
Were there any things that really surprised you where you looked at the results when you compiled them all and basically said to yourself, wow, I didn't see that coming?
Yeah. It's a good question. What I'll say is, on the data and kind of the findings and what people said, honestly, I wasn't that surprised. We weren't that surprised. I mean, we knew generally that, the system or schools weren't working for a lot of kids, and we need to do better. And so we heard that, and the data showed that, I think, and what we heard, from folks reinforced that. But I think the surprise to me, or not a surprise, it was also a hope, I think, coming into it, is when we asked the question, generally the question we asked in every conversation we had, every community meeting we had was, what opportunities do you want for your kids, your students, or your future employees? And then what do you think they need to learn in school? What is most important for them to learn in school? What are the most important experiences for them to have to reach those opportunities? And I think the surprise or exciting part about it for me or for us is that when we ask the question that way, regardless of who we're talking to, they largely said the same things. And so I think for us, a little bit surprising. That was the hope. But I think that is really the opportunity here too. When we're talking about the opportunities we want for kids and what they need to learn to get there, regardless of who we're asking, there's agreement there. And so that's an opportunity. We can focus on those things. And also the areas that were identified or what research data show are some of the most important things for kids to achieve better outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You said at the time that the report was released that of all the places you've worked, and we've talked about Boston, we talked about Chicago, you mentioned Colorado, you felt Arkansas was positioned to answer the needs of students. What did you mean by that? What positions Arkansas?
Well, it's a bit of what I talked about before. I think the conditions exist here. The ingredients exist, especially as it compares to some of those other places where I've done some of this work. I think, part of it's scale. We're talking about an entire state, but we have 1,050, roughly 1,000 schools 1,000 public schools in the entire state. That's a number we can impact. And we have, committed, engaged folks at all levels, and we have invested communities. All of these, this is the opportunity. Like, those are the ingredients we need. Now we have to figure out how to bring those together, leverage those, to move forward, to really have the impact that we want. But that is the opportunity. You
mentioned earlier the pandemic, and I don't see any other way of saying it, certainly here in Arkansas, across the rest of the country. Our kids really took a beating, didn't they, from an education standpoint?
They did, from an education and, really physical and mental health standpoint. And I think from an education standpoint, certainly, the disruptions to learning were massive. And the data show that. The data shows that. But then I think, the impacts on, things like mental health and the social aspects of school, those were pretty severe. They existed before the pandemic. So the pandemic did shed light on that in a way that it hadn't been before. But the pandemic had a big impact on that for many, many students. And, when students aren't physically or mentally healthy coming to school, their ability to learn, math, reading, whatever, is severely limited. If they're scared or anxious, they can't learn those things.
When I was reading about the report, there was one point where you were really, I got to tell you, preaching to the choir, because I say it when I give speeches across the state all the time, and that is we have got to expand that definition. We've long talked about K through 12. We've got to talk about early childhood now through 14 or 16. And you did touch on that, more early childhood on the front end and a better job of workforce training on the back end of the systems, right? Absolutely.
It's the entire, we call it the continuum. So almost cradle to career, some people call it. But so it's really, it starts, at a very young age, pre-K, early childhood. But then, our goals for students are that they have and are prepared for opportunities after education and opportunities to get good, high demand, living wage jobs so that they can be, productive members of society and happy and take care of their families. And so we have to look at it all the way from the beginning to that point.
We'll be back with more of the Southern Fried Podcast, but first, this break. Hi, Rex Nelson here. Thanks for listening so far. A lot of the topics we cover here on the Southern Fried Podcast and many more can be found on the pages of the Democrat Gazette. If you'd like to support this great newspaper's commitment to bringing you the latest in Arkansas news, sports, and entertainment, consider subscribing to the Democrat Gazette today. With your subscription, you'll get a digital edition of the newspaper every morning, along with the latest news and updates delivered to you on an iPad provided at no extra cost. You'll also get the same award-winning journalism you've come to expect from the Democrat Gazette, including my 3 weekly columns, plus exclusive photo galleries, videos, articles, and digital extras, all in the palm of your hand. As a bonus, we're offering a limited-time deal to our podcast listeners. To take advantage of this exclusive offer, click the link in the description or go to arkansasonline.com/podcast23. Welcome back to the Southern Fried Podcast, a production of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. You know, I admit my bias here. I spent 5 years full-time as president of the Association of the 11 4-year private colleges and universities in the state, so I'm very high on higher education. And in some places, you know, it's become popular to say, well, not everybody needs a college education. Well, certainly not everybody needs a 4-year degree. But certainly in Arkansas, you look at it, we need more bachelor's degrees, we need more master's degrees, we need more PhDs, but we also need more, and we've got 22 community colleges out there. We need more certificates, we need more associate's degrees, and that gets into that whole workforce training issue. Where I see Arkansas right now is we are, as you know, as statewide, doing pretty well economically. We need people, actually, more than we need jobs, as we're at historic low rates of unemployment. But the workforce participation level is really low in Arkansas when you look at it.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. And I think, you know, the pandemic had an effect on that, but also, you know, it comes down to preparation and readiness and access to opportunities as well. And I think, you know, what we say in the report, and I do want to say about that report, that is not meant to be, real quick, that is not meant to be Forward's report.
Yeah.
That is really meant to be a reflection of, it's meant to be a report for the state of Arkansas, and really a reflection of the voices of Arkansans. But on the career aspect, you know, we need a clear kind of comprehensive vision for workforce, for career education, and really that entire continuum. You know, you started to talk about different degrees and things like that. And you know, the way we think about it is, you know, we call it career pathways. And there are lots of pathways to a good career and a good job. And you know, some of them are 4-year college, some of them are associates, some are certificates right after. And, you know, every student needs access to all those, but also they need exposure and experience in them and start to build the skills they're going to need for those careers earlier on in school. And then, you know, as they get closer, they need more exposure and experience in those. And I think, you know, that's part of how we hopefully get there.
We have just passed in the Arkansas legislature a major education bill. It was done very quickly, frankly, with very little debate. I'm not going to make you get political. Don't worry.
Okay.
That's not what we're here for today. We're here to talk big picture. We're here to talk policy. But, you know, as you look at the landscape, and you could wave that magic wand and say either through future legislation or administratively, what, in your opinion, are we missing, and what are the big things we still need to do to make Arkansas public education as good as it possibly can?
You mean in general, or as it relates to that legislation?
In general.
In general?
In general, yeah. Let's pull out, you know, big picture. Here's what this state of just over 3 million people really needs to do.
Yeah. Well, what I think we need in this state, and really this is true in every state where I've worked. But, you know, we pass policy and, we set those priorities and we set those guidelines, and we determine how resources are allocated at that level. And that, that has a big impact, and that plays a big role. But that's just one piece. That's one lever. Where I think we need to focus, I'm not saying it's necessarily missing. I think we can definitely do better. We need to do better in this area. But it comes down to then from that policy standpoint, it comes down to strategy and implementation. So how are we then, carrying out those policies? How are we helping, down to the community and school level? Just because a policy is passed doesn't mean those folks down at that, at the local level know exactly what to do with that or how to leverage that or use the conditions that have been created. So I think, what we need is, as much energy. We need to continue that energy, all that energy that's been focused on policy in these recent weeks. We need to continue that same energy from as many or more people to continue the momentum on, how are we collectively working on these things as a state, and how are we engaging communities and ensuring that they have the tools and support to implement these policies and other strategies and approaches and get creative and innovative at the school, district, and community level in a way that addresses what students need most, and also acknowledges and addresses the local needs and priorities in that specific community.
Going back to the first of our conversation, we talked about the formation of Forward Arkansas, the philanthropic organizations, private foundations that were involved in informing it. To broaden that out to the corporate community and the business community, in your time in this job, have you found, for the most part, the business community in Arkansas is receptive to the kind of education reforms that we really need to achieve our potential in our education system here?
Yeah, in my experience so far, they definitely are. They definitely are. I think increasingly, and this is something we're trying to elevate and support. Increasingly, and what needs to happen is we need to see, and everyone needs to see, and business and business leaders need to see that the connection between education and economy and workforce, those are absolutely linked. Completely linked. And if we don't do education well, we're not going to do, we're not going to get to where we want to be able to strengthen the economy, get the workforce we need, things like that. So those have to be linked. I think the business community, again, in my experience, for the last 2.5 years is receptive to that, but it needs to be broadened. I think we need more business leaders involved, engaged, believing that and supporting that, invested in that.
All right. So you've got this report done. I know it was a massive effort. It's out. Where do we look to see forward going in the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, in your opinion? Sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just that report. Again, it's kind of it's a starting point. And so it's really, now the work begins, I think. So we are going to play a role, we'll play a role in, we have these priorities that emerge in the report. There's quite a bit of alignment with the legislation that's recently been passed. So there's a big opportunity there. We're now, but as I said before, it becomes strategy and implementation. So at the state level, what are the strategy and plans for implementing those policies and these things, and then how do we support communities to do it as well. And so we're going to play a role in both of those areas. So hopefully, as a strategic partner and support among state leaders, and also engaging the business community, engaging other influencers to be a part of this and invest in this. But then we're going to provide direct support in communities to help them, within these state level guidelines, help set that vision for their own community, their own kids, their own schools, and then identify approaches and solutions that they need to determine those, but they need and want support. We've found, and so we're going to help do that. But then I think on this report and the engagement, again, that's the engagement, the follow-up on this report and just in general, that needs to continue. We can't just engage folks one time, get their input, and then the engagement stops there. We need to continue that, talk about, measure the progress we're making, evaluate how we're doing, get feedback from folks again, and that needs to continually. We need to continuously improve, and that needs to continue to inform the work that Forward does, and I think really the state as a whole does.
I ask about the business community, and I've got to ask, and I know I'm asking you to paint with a broad brush, but in general, have you found administrators, superintendents, principals, others open to the kind of changes that the folks at Forward Arkansas think we need to make?
Yeah, I do. I think, largely, and this is painting with a broad brush.
It is. I know.
Yeah, it is painting with a broad brush.
I know it can differ from district to district, but I just wanted to get a general feel.
Look, I think
of whether those people are resistant to change or open to change.
No, I think there's an openness, right? And that's part of, the opportunity I see in Arkansas. I think there's an openness among educators, among district leaders, among school leaders, just in communities. And I think there's a strong desire because these are their communities. Yeah. There's a strong desire.
And I want to make the note personally when I use the term those people, I say it with the greatest admiration and respect. My dad sold athletic supplies to high schools all over the state my whole time growing up. So all the adults I knew growing up were school people, superintendents, principals, coaches, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the commitment is there. Largely the commitment is there. The desire is there. I think those are some of the hardest jobs, that exist, to be honest.
They really are.
And I think, a lot of the folks, we've been doing it one way, education, the system, for so long. And I think, some of those fundamental ways that we approach education, approach, instruction for kids, the experience for kids, some of that needs to change. But I think when you've been doing it one way for forever and that's all you've seen, it's hard to think outside of that. But I think if it's also in how we approach those communities and those local leaders. And if you approach them in a way that first acknowledges and recognizes their leadership, their expertise, acknowledges the unique needs they have in their schools and communities and what they want for their kids, and then help them identify solutions that are going to work for their communities and kids, then I think there's an openness to that. Whereas if we tell folks exactly what they need and how to do it without acknowledging their input, their voice, then there's going to be more resistance.
That makes sense. Ben, I told you this was going to go fast. We're out of time again, and I really want to thank you, and would love to have you back sometime. We'll update this because I know this is an ongoing work.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you having me and would love to come back.
All right, Ben Kutylo, he is the executive director of Forward Arkansas. We've been talking education reform in the state of Arkansas. Thank you for joining us for another edition of the Southern Fried Podcast, a production of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette.